One moment, they were celebrating his birthday. The next, his entire life was shattered by a secret so dark it destroyed everything. How far would you go to uncover the truth? The house in Austin, Texas was buzzing with preparations for my 44th birthday, and I couldn't help but feel a bit excited despite everything. Sarah, my wife of over 21 years, had been planning something big for weeks, dropping hints about a surprise that would blow my mind. She kept teasing me, saying this would be a birthday I'd never forget. Looking back, I realized she wasn't lying. Our life had been stable, at least on the surface. We'd built something solid over the years. A nice home, a son away at college now, and a marriage that wasn't perfect, but functional. Joshua, our son, had recently turned 20, and though he was away at Longhorn University, he decided to come home for the weekend to help with the party. It was his idea to invite a few of his friends to help decorate and set everything up. I didn't mind. Joshua's friends had been around the house enough times that I knew most of them. Some of the guys struck me as a bit too loud, a little too cocky, especially Tyler. Tyler always had this confident smirk, the kind that made me instinctively dislike him. But he was young, and I figured that's just how college students acted. Sarah and I had our ups and downs, like any couple married for over 2 decades. We weren't the same people we used to be and had fallen into a familiar routine, living side by side but not necessarily with each other. I chalked it up to the daily grind. My long hours managing construction projects and her busy schedule running her expanding online business. We didn't fight much, but we didn't communicate much either. I was 44 and she had just turned 42. And sometimes, it felt like we were more like roommates than partners. Yet I never imagined we'd end up where we were heading. That Friday evening before the party, Joshua's friends showed up to help with the final touches. I answered the door to see Tyler and 2 of his buddies, Nick and Zach, standing there, grinning like they owned the place. "Hey, Mr. Davis," Tyler greeted me, flashing that same irritating smirk. "Ready to have the best birthday ever?" I forced a smile, suppressing the irritation that always bubbled up when he was around. "Yeah, thanks for helping out," I said, stepping aside to let them in. Joshua's in the back setting up the decorations. Go give him a hand. They made their way past me, laughing and joking with each other. As they walked away, I caught a snippet of their conversation, Tyler's voice, loud and arrogant as usual. "Man, Mrs. Davis is still stunning. I can't believe she's—" I froze. My stomach tightened, and I felt the blood rush to my head. Were they talking about Sarah, my wife? Before I could fully process it, Nick elbowed Tyler, whispering something I couldn't catch, and they both burst into laughter. I clenched my fists, every instinct screaming at me to storm into the room and put them in their place. But I didn't. Instead, I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. They were just kids, I told myself, stupid, immature kids. Still, the disrespect gnawed at me. I waited until they were out of earshot before heading into the kitchen, where Sarah was busy arranging appetizers and setting up drinks for the next day. She always had an eye for detail, and the kitchen looked more like a fancy restaurant than a home. I walked up to her, still fuming, trying to keep my voice steady. "You'll never believe what I just overheard," I muttered, keeping my tone low. "Joshua's friends were talking about you, about how attractive you are. Can you believe that?" Sarah looked up, caught off guard. Her expression quickly shifted from surprise to an amused smile. "Oh, come on. They're just boys. They don't mean anything by it." I shook my head, feeling my anger flare. "It's disrespectful, Sarah. They're in our home, talking about you like that. I don't want to hear it again." She sighed and gave me a playful nudge, clearly trying to lighten the mood. "Relax, Tom. They're harmless. You're overreacting." I didn't argue further. Instead, I walked away, still unsettled but determined not to let it ruin the evening. I had bigger things to focus on, like enjoying my birthday. But the uneasy feeling lingered, like a warning I didn't fully understand. The next day, the house was transformed. Streamers hung from the ceiling. The smell of barbecue filled the air, and laughter echoed from the backyard as friends and family started to arrive. It was shaping up to be a perfect day. Sarah was by my side, smiling that bright smile of hers, charming everyone with her warmth. Joshua and his friends, Tyler, Nick, Zach, and a few others, moved between the guests, helping out and keeping the energy high. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, though. It wasn't just Tyler's smug grin or the way he always seemed to linger around Sarah. There was an uneasiness about the day, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. After all, it was my birthday, and I was surrounded by the people I loved. What could possibly go wrong? As the evening rolled on, people toasted, laughed, and enjoyed themselves. I tried to relax and soak in the attention and positive vibes. But then something strange happened. As I was mingling with the guests, I noticed Sarah slipping away from the group, heading inside the house. Joshua's friends trailed behind her. I watched them disappear into the hallway, my stomach twisting in knots again. What were they doing? My mind raced, trying to come up with a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. It was just Sarah and a bunch of college kids going upstairs toward our bedroom. I followed them, my heart pounding harder with every step. Standing outside our bedroom door, I hesitated. I could hear muffled voices, laughter, and the unmistakable sound of things being moved around inside. My mind ran wild with possibilities. What could they possibly be doing in there? I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The voices grew louder, and I could distinctly hear Sarah's laugh blending with theirs. Suddenly, it all clicked into place, and I realized I wasn't just imagining things. I was about to walk into something I wasn't prepared to handle. But I couldn't turn back now. I reached for the door, ready to confront whatever was happening on the other side. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound almost drowned out by the hushed voices and faint laughter coming from inside. My heart raced, my throat dry as sandpaper. I stepped into the room, and the sight before me froze the air in my lungs. There they were, Tyler, Nick, Zach, and two other guys I didn't recognize, all of them surrounding her. Sarah, my wife, was in the middle of it all. She was half-dressed, her clothes discarded on the floor, her body entangled with these boys. The same boys who had helped decorate for my birthday. My mind struggled to process the scene unfolding before me. I stood in the doorway, my body rooted to the spot, numb with disbelief. They didn't even notice me at first. The room was filled with a sickening mix of whispers, laughter, and inappropriate touches, their hands all over her as if they had no sense of shame or decency. And Sarah, my Sarah, was laughing along with them, almost encouraging their actions. The woman I'd shared my life with for over 21 years, the mother of my son, was completely caught up in whatever this sick, twisted moment had become. I don't remember when I started yelling. Maybe it was the moment I fully understood what I was seeing, or maybe it was the boiling rage inside me that finally broke loose. All I know is that I let out a roar that shook the walls. "What the hell are you doing?" Everything seemed to stop at once. Sarah turned to face me, her smile vanishing instantly, replaced by a look of shock and embarrassment. The boys staggered back, startled by my sudden presence. There was a moment of silence, a brief, terrible pause, before the room erupted into chaos. I didn't think. I couldn't think. The only thing I knew was that I needed to lash out, to make them pay for what they had done. I grabbed the nearest object within my reach, an old, heavy lamp that had been sitting on the nightstand for years. With a primal scream, I swung it at the closest body, Tyler. The crack of metal meeting flesh was sickening. Tyler staggered backward, clutching his shoulder as he yelled in pain. His cocky smirk was gone now, replaced by wide-eyed terror. "You little punks!" I roared, swinging the lamp again, this time at Nick, who barely dodged the blow. The room descended into complete chaos. They were yelling, trying to scramble away, but I was too fast. Rage fueled me, the kind of rage that comes from betrayal so deep it transforms you into something unrecognizable. I landed a hit on Zach's arm, sending him crashing into the dresser. But before I could swing again, they regrouped. There were 5 of them. 5 against 1. They were younger, stronger, and now they were angry too. Tyler recovered quickly, grabbing my arm before I could land another hit, and Nick and Zach joined in, pulling me down to the floor. The lamp slipped from my hand as fists rained down on me. I fought back with everything I had, throwing wild punches, trying to claw my way out from under them. I managed to connect a solid hit on one of the guys, hearing a satisfying crack as my fist hit his jaw. Blood spurted and he fell back with a groan, but it didn't last long. The others overpowered me quickly. They pinned me down, forcing my arms to the ground. I could taste blood in my mouth, the metallic tang mixing with the fury surging through me. Every inch of my body screamed in pain as they kicked and punched me. I felt something snap, my ribs, maybe, but I didn't care. I couldn't care. The pain was nothing compared to the betrayal. At some point, I managed to free myself, scrambling to my feet and stumbling toward the door. My vision was blurry, my head pounding, but I was driven by pure survival instinct now. I had to get out before they finished me off. I made it to the hallway, leaning against the wall for support, my body shaking with the effort. I could hear them shouting behind me, still in the room, but I didn't stop. I staggered down the stairs, gasping for air, my chest heaving with every painful breath. Then the guests heard it. The commotion, the shouting. People rushed in from the backyard, confused and alarmed. I collapsed in the middle of the living room, blood dripping from my nose and mouth, my clothes torn, bruises already forming across my arms and torso. And then Joshua appeared, his face pale as he took in the scene. He rushed toward me, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. "Dad, what happened? Are you okay?" He tried to help me stand, but I could barely move. I opened my mouth to say something, to warn him, to tell him to stay away. But before I could, he looked up and saw it. Behind me, coming down the stairs, was Sarah, his mother, disheveled, her clothes barely hanging on, looking stunned and panicked. The same group of college boys followed her, looking just as disheveled, some nursing the injuries I had managed to inflict. Joshua's eyes widened in horror as the truth crashed down on him like a wave. "Mom?" His voice shook, disbelief turning quickly into anger and disgust. "What is going on? What were you doing?" Sarah froze at the bottom of the stairs, her face pale as she finally seemed to understand the magnitude of what had just happened. She looked at Joshua, then at me, as if trying to find the words to explain, but there was nothing she could say. The damage was done. The living room fell deadly silent, the air thick with shock and disbelief as the guests, who had started to gather around, began to piece together what was unfolding in front of them. All eyes were on Sarah, my wife, standing there with a bunch of half-dressed college boys who were only a few years older than our son. Joshua's gaze darted between me and his mother, his face twisted with confusion and hurt. "Dad, why didn't you stop her sooner?" he stammered, tears brimming in his eyes as he took a step back, his voice cracking. "Mom, how could you do this?" I didn't have the strength to say anything, to explain. All I could do was watch, every muscle in my body aching, my world falling apart in slow motion. The murmurs among the guests grew louder, whispers full of shock and disbelief as they tried to make sense of the disaster that had unfolded. Finally, one of my friends stepped forward, breaking the silence. "Tom, what the hell is going on?" he asked, his voice heavy with concern and bewilderment. I forced myself to sit up, gasping for breath, wiping blood from my face. "Call the police," I managed to say, the words barely audible. "Just call the police." The room erupted into frantic movement as people scrambled to grab their phones. All I could do was sit there, staring at the wreckage of my life. Sarah stood motionless, her eyes flicking between Joshua and me, the weight of her actions finally sinking in. I turned to her, my voice ragged and hoarse. "We're done, Sarah. You're finished." Her face twisted in rage, not in guilt, not in sorrow, but pure, unfiltered rage. "You think you're better than me?" she spat, her eyes flashing with anger. "You think you can just walk away? You're nothing without me, Tom. Nothing." I had no words left, no fight remaining. My body was broken, and so was everything I had once believed in. All I could do was watch as the chaos swirled around us, waiting for the end of this nightmare. After the chaos of the night, the shock was palpable in the air. The entire house felt frozen, as if time itself had stopped for everyone inside. I pulled myself off the floor, every muscle aching, my head pounding from the beating I'd taken upstairs. The guests stared at me in horror, whispering amongst themselves, unsure of what to do next. How could they? No one expects to witness something so grotesque and unimaginable at a birthday party. Their stares, a mix of pity, disgust, and confusion, felt like daggers piercing my soul. But none of that mattered right now. I had to do what was necessary. "Everyone out," I rasped, my voice barely able to rise above a whisper. Then I found some strength, fueled by the burning rage still smoldering inside me. "Now! Everybody out!" People scrambled, grabbing their belongings, their faces pale with shock. Some murmured their apologies, others avoided looking me in the eye entirely. But I didn't care. I didn't want anyone's sympathy or pity. I just wanted them gone. The fewer witnesses to this disgrace, the better. As the last of the guests hurried out of the house, I locked the door behind them, leaning my forehead against it for a moment, trying to catch my breath. My entire body throbbed with pain from the beating. My ribs felt like they were on fire, and my vision was still blurry from the hits I'd taken. But none of that pain compared to the agony inside me. The knowledge that the woman I had loved, the woman I had spent my life with, had just destroyed everything. She had ruined us. I turned to face Sarah. She hadn't moved from the bottom of the stairs, still standing there, barely clothed. Her face contorted in a mixture of fear, anger, and disbelief. Behind her, Joshua stood paralyzed, tears streaming down his face. My heart ached for him, my son, having to witness the unimaginable betrayal of his own mother. He shouldn't have had to see this. None of this should have happened. "I'm calling the police," I said, my voice steady now, anger hardening every word. "You're what?" Sarah spat, taking a step forward, her face twisted in disbelief and fury. "Don't be ridiculous, Tom. Don't make this worse than it already is." "Worse?" I laughed, a hollow, bitter sound escaping my throat. "Worse, Sarah. You destroyed everything. You let those kids do that to you in our own house. This is over. We're done." My voice cracked, but I forced myself to stand tall despite the pain coursing through my body. Sarah's face shifted from shock to something darker, something colder. She crossed her arms over her chest and sneered at me. "You think you can just throw me out? You think you have that kind of power? You've always been weak, Tom. Pathetic." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Even after everything, after what she'd done. She stood there, blaming me, as if I were the villain. I didn't know this woman anymore. The wife I thought I knew had vanished, replaced by a stranger I didn't recognize. Ignoring her, I picked up my phone, my hands shaking, and dialed the police. Joshua just stood there in stunned silence, his eyes locked on his mother as if trying to make sense of the depths of her betrayal. As I waited for the line to connect, Sarah stared at me with cold, calculating eyes. It didn't take long for the police to arrive. The officers entered the house, their expressions hardening when they saw me, bruised, bloodied, barely able to stand. I recounted everything to them in a cold, detached voice. The affair, the fight, the twisted betrayal that had unfolded before my eyes. I watched as they took notes, their faces grim, their eyes shifting between me, Sarah, and the group of college boys who still stood around like deer caught in headlights. The boys were taken into custody without much resistance. Tyler, always trying to act tough, muttered some half-hearted insults as they cuffed him, but even he knew he had no way out of this. Sarah stood silently off to the side, her arms crossed, glaring at me as if I had been the one to wrong her. She didn't even try to defend herself. No apologies, no explanations, just a cold, bitter stare as they led her away along with the rest of them. Before Sarah was taken out the door, I met her gaze one last time. "I'm filing for divorce," I said, my voice steady, though my chest felt like it was about to collapse. "We're finished. You'll never see me or Joshua again." For a moment, I thought I saw something flicker in her eyes. Regret, guilt, maybe even fear. But then it was gone, replaced by a look of pure hatred. "You're making a mistake, Tom," she hissed, venom dripping from every word. "You think you're going to come out of this on top? You think you can just get rid of me? You don't know who you're dealing with. You're finished, Tom. You hear me? You're nothing." The officers let her out, and as I watched her leave, a strange sense of relief washed over me. It was over. She was gone, and with her, all the lies, all the deceit, and all the poison that had been eating away at our marriage for years. Or so I thought. The next morning, I woke up sore and battered, but determined. I had barely slept that night, my mind racing, trying to piece together the shattered fragments of my life. Joshua had gone to stay with a friend, and I spent the night alone in our house, my house now. I was just beginning to process everything when I heard a loud knock at the door, then another one, more insistent. I dragged myself to the door, still stiff from the beating I'd endured the night before. I opened it to find a group of men standing there, 5 or 6 of them, all rough-looking, built like they could have been linebackers in another life. They weren't from around here. I'd never seen them before. But they weren't the kind of people you forgot easily. Their eyes were cold, predatory, with a certain menace. One of them, a tall guy with a shaved head and a deep scar running across his cheek, stepped forward. "You Tom?" he asked, his voice rough, like gravel grinding beneath heavy boots. "Yeah," I said, my stomach tightening. "Who are you?" He smirked, but it wasn't friendly. "You pissed off the wrong people, Tom." Before I could react, they lunged. The next few minutes were a blur of fists and pain. They didn't hold back. The blows came fast and hard, driving me down to the floor in seconds. I tried to fight back, but I was already weakened, and these guys were professionals. I felt ribs crack under their relentless pounding, my vision swimming as they laid into me. Each hit sent waves of agony through my battered body. I tasted blood, felt the world spinning, but I refused to pass out. Not like this. When they were finally done, they left me lying on the floor, gasping for breath, every inch of my body screaming in pain. I could barely move, my entire body a broken mess. They stood over me, satisfied with their work, before one of them crouched down next to me. "Consider this a warning," he said, his voice low and cold. "Stay out of Sarah's way. If you file those divorce papers, if you press charges, if you even think about causing her trouble, we'll be back. And next time, you won't get off this easy." I barely registered his words as they left, the door slamming behind them. I lay there on the floor, staring at the ceiling, my body broken, my life in ruins. Sarah had done this. She had connections, dangerous ones, and I had no idea. I didn't know who she really was. The house was silent after the gang left, their threats still echoing in my ears. I lay there on the cold floor for what felt like hours, every breath and effort as my ribs ached and bruises throbbed. The pain was unbearable, but it was nothing compared to the humiliation. Everything about my life had come crashing down in just a matter of days. My marriage, my reputation, and now even my safety. Sarah, the woman I had spent over 2 decades with, wasn't just someone who had betrayed me. She was connected to people who could kill me if they wanted. I had no idea who she really was, no idea what kind of past she'd hidden from me all these years. And now, I was paying the price. I managed to pull myself up eventually, every movement sending sharp stabs of pain through my body. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. The police weren't going to help. This was bigger than just an affair. Sarah had connections, criminal ones, and whoever those guys were, they had come to protect her, and she had sent them. She wasn't done with me yet, and as much as I wanted to fight back, I needed more information. I needed to know who I was dealing with. That's when I decided to hire a detective. I had no other choice. I made the call the next morning despite the bruises still fresh and aching across my face and torso. My body was wrecked, but my mind was sharp with rage and determination. I wasn't going to sit around and let Sarah destroy what little was left of my life. I needed answers. and I needed someone who could dig into the past I had clearly been blind to all these years. The detective's name was Frank Harris, a grizzled, no-nonsense private investigator who had been recommended by an old friend. When he showed up at my house, he took one look at me, his brow furrowing at the sight of my bruises. "You look like you've been through hell," he said, his voice gruff as he stepped inside, taking in the wreckage of what used to be a home. I gave a dry laugh, wincing as the movement sent pain through my cracked ribs. "You have no idea." We sat down, and I told him everything. The affair, the group of college kids, the beating, and the gang that had shown up to finish the job. I laid it all out, not holding anything back, even though every word felt like another dagger in my chest. He listened carefully, not interrupting, just nodding now and then as he took notes. "So," he said when I finally finished, "you think your wife's tied up with some dangerous people, and she sent them to make sure you didn't take things any further?" I nodded. "They said they'd come back if I pressed charges or filed for divorce." Harris leaned back in his chair, rubbing his stubbled jaw thoughtfully. "And you've got no clue what she's involved in? Nothing from her past that stands out?" "Nothing," I admitted, feeling like a fool. "I don't know who the hell she is anymore." He sighed, pulling out a pack of cigarettes from his coat. "Well, looks like we're going to have to dig deep. I'll start by looking into her past, old records, contacts, anything that might give us a lead. But I'll warn you, Tom, if she's got ties to serious criminals, this could get ugly." I already knew it was ugly. I nodded, too exhausted to care. "Do whatever it takes. I need to know." Days passed. I kept a low profile, doing my best to avoid any further confrontations with the people Sarah had sent after me. Joshua was still staying with his friend, refusing to come home. He couldn't even look at me after what had happened, and I didn't blame him. His mother had betrayed both of us, and the shame was more than he could bear. Meanwhile, Harris worked in the background, piecing together the fragments of Sarah's hidden life. It didn't take long for him to uncover what I'd feared. Sarah had a history, one that stretched far beyond what I ever could have imagined. She had been involved with some shady characters in her youth, men who operated on the fringes of society, dealing in drugs, money laundering, and God knows what else. She'd cleaned up her act, or so I thought when we met. But it seemed like those old ties had never really disappeared. "She's in deep," Harris told me over the phone one evening. "There's a lot of stuff buried in her past, but what's clear is that she knows dangerous people. People who don't mind doing favors for old friends, like sending a gang of thugs to rough you up. She's not just playing house anymore, Tom. She's gone back to whatever life she had before." That was the final straw. But then it got worse. Harris called me one afternoon with new information, something I hadn't seen coming. "Tom, you're not going to like this," he said, his voice unusually tense. "I've been tracking her movements, and it looks like she's stolen a good chunk of money from your joint accounts. A sizable sum. She's gone." My stomach dropped. I hadn't checked the account since the incident with the gang. I had been too focused on surviving the day-to-day nightmare, and now she had taken the one thing I had left, my financial security. "Do you know where she went?" I asked, my voice tight with panic. Harris paused. "I've got a lead. She's been spotted heading toward the woods on the outskirts of town, but there's something else. People say she's been meeting with some old contacts, possibly trying to score drugs. It's not just money, Tom. She's getting desperate." We tracked her down that evening, driving out to a remote area of forest just outside the city. It was a place I had never been before, an old, abandoned stretch of woods where no one would go unless they had something to hide. The trees loomed tall and foreboding as we pulled up, the only sound being the crunch of gravel beneath our tires. "Stay here," Harris said, gripping his camera tightly. "I'll get some footage. We need evidence if we're going to use this against her." I nodded, staying inside the car as he crept through the woods, his silhouette disappearing into the trees. My heart was pounding in my chest as I waited, my thoughts racing. Sarah, my wife, the woman I thought I knew, was somewhere out there doing God knows what. I felt sick to my stomach. Harris returned a few minutes later, his face grim. "She's out there with some guys. It looks like she's trying to score something. Drugs, maybe." I've got it all on tape. I glanced toward the woods, my breath catching in my throat. What now? We get out of here, he said firmly. We've got enough. Let's go. As we started to pull away, something moved in the trees. A flash of movement. Then suddenly, there she was. Sarah burst from the tree line, wild-eyed and frantic, her clothes disheveled, her hair tangled. She saw the car and sprinted toward us, her voice rising in a desperate scream. "Tom, you bastard! Get back here! You can't leave me, Tom!" Her voice echoed through the woods as Harris floored the gas, the car speeding down the dirt road. I looked back through the rear-view mirror and saw her chasing after us, her figure shrinking as we sped away. She kept running, screaming, until she was nothing but a speck in the distance. I couldn't believe it. The woman I had spent 2 decades with, the woman I had shared my life with, had become something unrecognizable. She wasn't just a liar and a cheater. She was a criminal. Someone who had been hiding a dark, twisted life from me all along. We drove in silence, the weight of everything crushing down on me. I had the evidence now, enough to take to the police, enough to finally put an end to all of this. But as I sat there, staring out at the dark sky, I couldn't help but feel the overwhelming sense of loss. My life had been destroyed. Sarah had ripped everything apart, and I wasn't sure if I'd ever be able to put the pieces back together. The silence in the car was deafening. The further we drove from the forest, the more distant everything felt. The past, the years I'd spent with Sarah, the life I thought I knew. It was all slipping away like a bad dream, one that left behind an ugly residue that clung to everything. The woman I had loved for over 20 years was gone. She had been gone long before I realized it, replaced by a stranger with secrets darker than I could have ever imagined. As Harris drove, I stared blankly out the window, trying to make sense of the chaos swirling in my head. There was no making sense of it, though, not now, maybe not ever. Sarah had been hiding so much from me. Her past, her criminal connections, and now her addiction. I'd spent all this time thinking our marriage was just in a rut, that we were drifting apart like any long-term couple might. But the truth was far worse. She had been living a double life, and I had been too blind to see it. Harris broke the silence, his voice rough but calm. "We've got enough evidence to put her away for a long time, Tom. The tape, the money she stole, the drugs. We'll take this to the police, and they'll handle it. You don't have to worry about her anymore." I nodded, though the relief didn't come as easily as I thought it would. "Yeah, you're right." But even as I said it, a part of me still couldn't believe how far things had gone. I'd always imagined that betrayal meant someone finding comfort in another's arms. A fling, an affair, something that hurt, but was understandable. But this was something different. It was the destruction of everything I believed in, everything I had built. Sarah's lies had cut deep, and I wasn't sure if I would ever fully recover. The next morning, we handed the evidence over to the police. Harris had everything. Footage of Sarah making the deal in the woods, the drugs, the stolen money trail from our joint accounts. There was no doubt she was involved in something much bigger than a simple affair. The detectives we spoke to were quick to act. They'd seen it before. People spiraling into the underworld without their families even knowing. Sarah was no exception. By that evening, Sarah had been arrested. The police picked her up at a rundown motel called the Sunset Inn near the outskirts of town. They found drugs on her, enough to charge her with possession with intent to distribute. I sat in the living room, the house empty and echoing with silence, when I got the call from one of the detectives. "She's in custody," he said, his voice clipped and professional. "Looks like she's been using for a while, Tom. We found more than just a small stash on her. She's deep into this. I'm sorry." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed was worse than I thought. Sarah was a drug addict. All this time, while I was working long hours to keep us afloat, she had been slipping further and further into a life I knew nothing about. I hung up the phone and sat there, staring at the walls of the home we had built together. Everything felt hollow, like the life I'd lived was just an illusion, a house of cards that had come crashing down in one swift, brutal moment. The legal process moved quickly after that. Sarah had no way to fight the charges. Between the drugs, the money she had stolen, and the overwhelming evidence Harris had gathered, there was no escaping it. She was going away for a long time. As for the boys, the ones who had been involved with her, who had turned my birthday into a nightmare, they didn't get off scot-free either. The police charged them with contributing to the delinquency of an adult, though the brunt of the legal system's wrath came in the form of hefty fines. They weren't innocent in any of this, but Sarah had been the real criminal. The court slapped them with fines high enough to make them pay for their part in this twisted mess. Tyler, with his usual arrogance, had no words when he stood in front of the judge. Neither did Nick or Zach. They were just scared kids who got caught up in something far worse than they had anticipated. They didn't look so smug anymore. As for Sarah, she never showed any remorse, at least not to me. I didn't go to her hearings, didn't bother to hear whatever excuses she might have for what she'd done. I didn't want to see her. The woman I'd known was gone, and I had no interest in speaking to the stranger she had become. Weeks passed. The house felt unbearably empty, like it wasn't even mine anymore. Joshua stayed away, still with his friend, too shocked and hurt to deal with the fallout of what his mother had done. I couldn't blame him. I didn't know how to deal with it myself. Some nights I found myself pacing the house, walking from room to room trying to understand where everything had gone wrong. But there were no answers, no clues that could make sense of it all. I thought about the early years with Sarah, when everything had been simple. We were young, in love, building a life together. I thought we had it all figured out, but maybe I had been fooling myself even then. There were probably signs, small, subtle signs, that I had chosen to ignore, that I had brushed off as normal marital issues. But now, looking back, I realized I had been blind to who she really was. The day the divorce was finalized was the day I felt the first real sense of closure. Sarah was gone for good, locked up, out of my life. The paperwork was simple, almost anticlimactic. A few signatures, a few legal formalities, and it was done. Just like that, over 20 years of marriage, of shared memories, of love and betrayal, were reduced to a few sheets of paper. I walked out of the lawyer's office that day feeling lighter, though the weight of everything still pressed on me. It wasn't something I could just shrug off. The damage was deep, and I knew it would take time to heal. But there was something else, a sense of hope, however small, that maybe, just maybe, I could rebuild. Sitting on the porch that evening, watching the sun set behind the trees, I finally let myself breathe. It wasn't over. There was still a long road ahead. But I had made it through the worst of it. Sarah was gone. The lies were gone. And the weight of her betrayal, while still heavy, was no longer suffocating me. I didn't know what the future held. I didn't know if Joshua would ever fully recover from the trauma his mother had inflicted on him, or if I would ever trust anyone again. But for the first time in months, I felt a flicker of hope. A small, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, I could recover from this. I could.